But I'm very excited to host Tim. I've had the pleasure of, despite being very new here, getting to meet Tim and work with Tim a little bit. Tim has a very interesting approach, I would say, focused on trying to understand how human societies can be more sustainable from the perspective of an economist, an ecologist, a social scientist, a quantitative computational scientist. So Tim brings a lot of very interesting things together. And I won't say too much more. I'll just hand it over to you, Tim. Thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thanks, Andy. My pleasure. Absolutely. So I'm going to get started here. I'm going to figure out how to that's the way I like to arrange you, so I can generally talk at your faces. There we go. Yeah, so thank you. I'm excited to talk to the School of Biology and Ecology. I've been meaning to do this for ages. The reason is I sort of am primarily a biologist among all of those things, motivated by life as the most interesting phenomenon in the universe, and evolution as a really good way to understand it. So I came to study humans and human evolution and human culture from the perspective of, this is the most interesting study species I can find. So before I start, I just want to also, I'm going to dive right in. So my study species is Homo sapiens, right? And so quick bio quiz, which order do they belong to? Does anyone know? It's order, like who looks up, like who has that in their heads? It's primates, right? We're primates. We know what primates look like. Then why is it that from a distance we look like a slime mold? That's weird, right? It really is weird. We look like a glowing slime mold from space. Is that what primates look like? That's the kind of sort of fun biology question that I love to dive into. And because biology answered so many of my questions when I was young, I have full faith it will be able to answer them now. However, it might have to take us further afield. So I'm going to be trying to address this here. And I'm going to start by taking us on a little bit of an exploration. And we're going to start with this framework that was developed in the early 90s by Maynard Smith and Zutmery called The Major Transitions in Evolution. This is a sort of a book and a couple of papers where they look at trying to understand a number of the major events in the history of life on Earth that have had huge impact on not just life, but sort of evolution itself over time. This is the integration of DNA from sort of transitioning from RNA to DNA. This is the emergence of cells from sort of replicating molecules, the emergence of eukaryotes, multicellular organisms, and even perhaps human societies with language. There's a little bit of a question there for a lot of people. Do we constitute a major evolutionary transition? And what is a major evolutionary transition? That's the domain we're going to be focused on. And Maynard Smith and Zutmery found a handful of common patterns, which is what made this work so exciting for people. And those common patterns were, first, a division of labor among these smaller units that form a larger unit, like cells in a body. The second is a loss of reproductive capacity. Individual cells in your body, unless you have cancer, can't reproduce, which is really important. Then still, cancer is an example of another common problem, which is conflicts between individuals and groups that can happen during these major evolutionary transitions. And then finally, another common pattern is the emergence of these new modes of information transmission, such as communication between DNA and protein, or cell developmental signals, or perhaps human language. So this frame of research has been slow for a long time, but has slowly also been improved over time, particularly recently with what is now called the evolutionary transitions in individuality. This is a more refined and sharp framework for understanding how and when evolution happens to take a lineage from a bunch of sort of individuals into clusters of individuals and cooperative groups, and from cooperative groups into something that can be truly said to be a new individual at another level of organization. And so the original framework was sort of came about in part as a response to try to understand this question of the emergence of complexity and hierarchical organization in nature. And the evolutionary transitions in individuality is trying to sharpen that down and to focus particularly on the emergence of new levels of biological organization and of evolution in particular. There are a bunch of different ways that evolutionary transitions in individuality can sort of come about now that we've been sort of studying them and trying to look across all of life as we can see it. For example, we can see examples of major evolutionary transitions between species, such as the endosymbiotic hypothesis that Lynn Margulis came up with back when she was still called Lynn Sagan in '67, where we had bacterium, forming an endosymbiotic relationship with a larger cell. Now, so that is one type of potential evolutionary transition that happened. It's very well sort of evidenced. I want to just point out here that the lower levels, right? These lower levels don't go away, right? We still have mitochondria in our cells. Plants still have what remains of those cyanobacteria, which we now call chloroplasts, in their cells. And that's an important component of this process, although they do tend to become simplified over long-term evolutionary time. Of course, the big example that we all think about because they characterize us is multicellular organisms, right? So here is a beautiful example, and you can sort of zoom all the way down the sort of levels of biological organization to see our cells. And the best example of, the most studied example of the evolution of multicellularity comes from this Volvox algae, which has been sort of estimated to have diverged from its unicellular ancestors around 200 million years ago in the Triassic, which is pretty cool. And you can see there are species sort of all the way along different parts of it. So different lineages made it somewhere along this sort of long-term transition to this Volvox thing, which is a ball. And it can reproduce asexually or sexually, both, but it's still pretty much sort of only just barely sort of multicellular. While it is properly multicellular, it's a really good example because it's so clearly made of what was clearly most recently a bunch of single-celled algae with a couple of flagella. So there's another really good example as well, and that is animal societies, and particularly insect societies. Insect societies are fascinating entirely in their own right, and they're even more fascinating if you think of them as being a way to learn a little bit more about how disconnected evolutionary transitions might happen amongst individuals who are not physically next to each other. And so here we have wonderful termite mounds. And these are special in a lot of different ways. One of the things that, or here a set of characteristics that describe some of these eusocial insect societies is they can have city-states of millions in a built environment. And they are very often obligately dependent on agriculture, collecting leaves, growing fungus on those leaves and eating that fungus. They have a full-time complex division of labor. They use special modes of information sharing. This is a common pattern, communicating with chemical and pheromones to convey intent and task and status and things like this. And they have self-sacrifice for collective defense as well. One of the things that I have not included here, which you'll notice is sort of almost intentionally left out, is I didn't mention that there's a queen. There's reproductive division of labor in a lot of these insect eusocial societies. And indeed, that's what makes them eusocial. The definition here leaves off the queen because the idea is to define something that goes part way, and that's this ultra-sociality. So what we can do now, given the literature as it is we can say, look, okay, give me an organism and the raw materials, and I can bake you a superorganism. This is my recipe. You guys are welcome to use it. I highly recommend sprinkling in between group variation. That's a really important step. Makes them especially tasty. So the question for us is, are humans undergoing an evolutionary transition in individuality? And how do we evaluate that? And what does that mean? We, of course, have city-states, right? We have a reliance on agriculture, heavy reliance on agriculture. We have full-time, very complex, far more complex division of labor. And we have information sharing, all sorts of fancy information sharing. I don't need to tell you, you're on the other end of a computer. And we have self-sacrifice for collective defense. So we exhibit a lot of characteristics that are highly reminiscent of the major transitions in evolution as Maynard Smith and Zutmery first proposed them, and that are similar to eusocial insects. And of course, I'm not the first to have thought of this. In fact, the idea of society as some larger level organism is a very old idea. And there's been actually a lot of, if you try to take a big perspective on this, there's a lot of disagreement and confusion about this question, about whether humans are going through a transition, have gone through a transition, are clearly not going through a transition, will go through a transition, what the transition is. There's been a lot of discussion on it in anthropology, especially, as well as in biology. And if I were to sort of try to characterize it in a general way, anthropologists have been repeatedly saying, look, human culture, human organizations, human institutions, and society exhibit complex interlocking systems which create a new type of individual. Again and again, we see this. It may have been with agriculture, it may be with institutions generally, it may be the emergence of the state, or maybe even simply the emergence of the socially identified tribal unit. But yes, and it's happening in a cultural way. However, this debate is not at all sort of concluded, in part because biologists look at this and say, no, there are no morphological castes. There's no reproductive centralization or division of labor. Some biologists say, oh yeah, it happened 2.6 million years ago, and we're done. We've already done this. I think the most common perspective in biology is the idea that humans may have begun something like this, and we partway through some sort of major evolutionary transition, but we're kind of stalled. And we're stalled for some very concrete, heavy reasons. The biggest one being that we are moving around between groups more than we ever have in the history of our species. We are migrating and reproducing increasingly between groups. And in a sort of spatial sense, genetic FST is decreasing. So what this means is the potential for biological group selection, for us to form these groups which are competing as a bunch of little organisms, as we can think of termites had to have done when they moved from transition from, say, being solitary individuals to being large colonies, is not possible. We're too intermixed. So this is a big problem here, right? Because in a lot of ways, we have sort of a tale of two transitions. There's definitional issues. The biologists are saying, this is what an evolutionary transition in individuality looks like, okay? And it's not happening. It's quite clear. On the other hand, the anthropologists are saying, well, no, we're talking about this, and it's definitely happening, and it's happened multiple times, depending on how you count. So there's a definitional issue. We need to understand sort of what culture is and how it is involved. And we need to understand if there's any kind of relationship between these things. So there are research questions for this piece of work, come down to sort of three, really, and one easy one at the end, or easy one at the beginning. Can this confusion and disagreement be resolved? I think it can. Is our species undergoing some form of evolutionary transition and individuality? Okay, and if so, how? What is the role of culture in human evolution generally, and how does that relate? And then finally, how do genes and culture interact in the very long term? To understand these, we're going to have to sort of dive into cultural evolution, which is my gig. So cultural evolution research has flourished since the 80s. And here are some books. We have a professional society, scientific society. It's a lot of fun. I highly welcome any more clever biologists. The idea of cultural evolution is really quite straightforward. The idea is simple, that we have cultural traits in the same way that we might have phenotypic or genotypic traits. And those cultural traits are defined by the fact that they're socially transmitted information. And they constitute, culture in general constitutes a Darwinian inheritance system because those cultural traits vary. They have consequence. And as a result of having consequence, they can cause selection in a couple of different ways. If you have a really bad idea about how to drive your car in an innovative way, you might die, and the idea might die with you, for example. Or perhaps it's just an unpopular idea and it might not spread. But there's the second or the third point, which is for a Darwinian inheritance system, we need inheritance as well. And of course, culture is highly transmissible. We spread it all the time. So culture is at least partly Darwinian. It interacts with genetic evolution, and we'll be diving into that, but it's also different than genetic evolution. And it's got a bunch of cool stuff going on, including for those of you who study non-human species. There's lots of really cool research in culture in non-human species, birds and cetaceans and stuff. Here's a quick overview of some of the history of cultural evolution. And there are two things I'm going to point out here. The first is that there's a very strong consensus that on a couple of key features. The first is that culture is a special type, constitutes a special type of inheritance. Secondly, it emerged in part because it helped humans spread and adapt to new ecological environments all over the planet over the last 50 or 70,000 years. We've largely done that not by morphological variation and adaptation, but by cultural variation and adaptation. And finally, it's a key part of human evolutionary and ecological success, this cultural adaptation. So that's the first part. This is to summarize a very large amount of work, and here are some of the key books over time. But I think a second piece is this question of how have people thought about the way that genes and culture interact? And I'll highlight E.O. Wilson and Charles Lumsden's perspective on this. They were some of the first to create mathematical models of gene-culture coevolution, and they had this key assumption that genetic natural selection operates in such a way, it operates the cognitive machinery of human cultural capacity. And it operates in such a way that it must keep culture on a leash, right? So if I'm capable of thinking thoughts that are so dumb that I kill myself or render myself non-reproductive, that is probably going to cause some natural selection on not just the thoughts, but on the genes themselves that allow me to have those thoughts. So that's a powerful idea. It's a common idea in this literature as well, but it's not the only sort of approach. I wanted to highlight it though, and now we're going to talk about sort of what the rest of cultural evolution looks like. And it's different. It's not the same as genetic evolution. For one, if we take a look at the roots of information transmission, you can see they're very different, right? We have all sorts of horizontal transfer. In fact, that's sort of like this main component, is that there's tons of within generation transmission happening. So that's an important component. If we look at cultural patterns of cultural variation, rather than being sort of largely random in nature, cultural evolution tends to be highly guided, very often with intentionality and even modeling of future consequences built into the nature of the way that we change our own behavior or modify the behaviors of others that we've imitated. Transmission. So instead of inheriting information vertically from our parents, we also get it from our peers. But importantly, we can get it from an unlimited number of peers, right? We can imitate whoever we want, as many people as we want, and pick the best people to imitate and pick the best traits to imitate. And so that brings us to our third point, which is selection. Not only, of course, can culture bring natural selection down upon it, but there's another force of a selective process operating on culture, and that is strategic social learning. This is when you choose who to learn from, right? Of course, it's probably not a surprise to say that probably a lot of people try to choose people who would be good to learn from rather than to be bad to learn from. Even if you're wrong, it represents some sort of selective process. So because you could use imitation cues based on their success or their age or their reproductive success or non-biological wealth or what have you. Okay. So this gives us, if we can think of culture as being a full Darwinian system, plus some extra weirdness, right? We can think of it as a system of dual inheritance. And this is the model that has been developed since the 80s. With a number of really great mathematical frameworks for understanding gene-culture coevolution called dual inheritance. Now, to compare the two, we can look at genetic inheritance as flowing sort of directly from genome to genome via passive copying of the actual genetic traits themselves. In culture, it doesn't work that way. We go instead, typically the child generation will have to look at the phenotype. You don't have access to the brain where the thing is stored. You have to look at the phenotype. You have to observe the behavior of the person and then try to back out and infer what it was that they were intending to do and whether that's a good idea given the context, and then use that to create your own system about how you want to behave. So as a result, what we can say, at least, is that it's not a parallel process in the same way, which is interesting because it means that there will be some differences, and it means that the interaction between genes and culture over time are going to be interesting. Just to round it off, cultural evolution is also highly cumulative. We build things and then we build things with those things. We build language and then we build language on top of that language. Organizations, et cetera, you name it. It's also faster than genetic evolution when you measure it apples to apples. And there's good evidence, I think, and this is just one example, that it has become humans' primary mode of adaptation, that we have since we sort of moved out of Africa and began adapting culturally and with technological methods all over the planet, have adapted largely culturally to new environments. So how does that mean that culture interacts with genes? If it's faster and our primary mode of adaptation, and yet still held on a genetic leash? To understand that, let's take a look into the literature here. I want to say, by the way, that a lot of this comes from a paper and ongoing work with Zach Wood, where we're trying to synthesize a lot of the literature that's out there already. So I want to talk about yaks, and yaks are useful. Yaks are great. You can eat yak meat. You can use yaks to carry things. You can drink yak milk. You can drink yak blood. You can turn yak milk into butter. You can use it for lamps. Yaks are extremely useful. And so this is just a great example of a very specific type of practice, which is a whole collection of culturally transmitted traits about resource collection that help a specific population, in this case, Tibetans, survive in a really brutal environment because yaks are benefiting their nutrition and their survival. Now, these practices are culturally transmitted. They're not simple. They take skill and knowledge to be able to access the resources of yaks and all of the benefits that come from them. And so this underscores the point that culture emerged because it's adaptive, right? Because it helps us take advantage of environmental affordances to our own fitness benefits. So the idea here is, in part, humans have conquered the planet because of culture, because it's allowed us to do that, to evolve faster than the yaks are, right? Okay, so an example of this here is that we just take the yak thing to the next level, dairying. The best example of gene culture coevolution, the best evidenced example and the most well-studied, is the coevolution of dairying culture and the ability for humans to digest lactose as an adult. Sort of the default position, the wild state of humans is that we do not digest lactose as adults. That's a relatively recent trait which has spread, and it has spread. The idea is it has spread quite closely with the dairying culture itself, which of course should not be a surprise. So in this study, you can look at the greatest milk gene diversity is in this particular region of Northern Europe. The greatest frequency of the adult lactase persistence gene is in a similar dark orange zone, and archaeological evidence of the Neolithic cattle pastoralist culture is in the same area. There's been a lot of work on this. It all leads to the same set of conclusions, which are basically that in that area emerged a population which happened to have some adult lactase persistence and started drinking the milk of those cattle. And that population did well, and the gene spread along with the cultural trait. And doing so, of course, enabled a positive feedback between the cultural trait and the gene. And that both spread. In fact, both have spread around the world. There are other examples of gene culture coevolution that I'll get to in a moment. But I want to highlight some of the modern components here. This gene culture coevolution story is not done. Because dairying has been taken to scale. In fact, it has spread far beyond the allele. It's spread to some of us here are probably lactose intolerant. My wife is lactose intolerant. And yet we do things like this with cows. And it's also spread to Japan, where almost no one is lactose tolerant as an adult. And yet they drink milk. In fact, they teach kids in elementary school to drink milk. It's part of, it's provided, despite the fact that it's not well digested. So this is a really interesting question. And it underlines this potential that genes are slowly somehow becoming less important in human lives. So gene culture coevolution is a big field. Here are a handful of other examples. Two things I want to point out here are that it hasn't been well sort of organized. And we're going to step you through how Zach and I sort of thought through to try to organize all of these various patterns. Secondly, the research often leaves out what we might think of as the current processes, right? It gets us up to sort of modern humans in the archaeological sense, and stops there, and for good reason, because the rest of it's all sorts of complex. So what we did in this 2021 paper, which if you haven't read, I highly suggest you do, because it's got pretty figures in it. Here's one of them. The dairying example is a great example of what we call trait pair gene culture coevolution. We have a very specific genetic trait. It could be a cluster of traits. We have a very specific cluster of cultural traits, and they have positive feedback relationship, right? They benefit each other and they spread sort of mutualistically. Okay. There are a number of examples of this trait pair style. However, importantly, that's not the only way that gene culture coevolution can happen. In fact, a lot of the literature out there is about this other process where we have a genetic trait which influences our entire ability to produce culture in the first place, our ability to make a diversity of language sounds. Our vocal tract is actually quite specialized. We can make a lot of sounds, and this is not actually the case for other primates. We have a lot of sort of social and imitative abilities. And so the idea is something's going on with specific genetic traits that allow us to have a whole range, to sort of keep a whole range of cultural repertoire in our heads, to transmit and understand and infer and innovate these cultural traits, because the cultural traits then, and when that diversity benefits us, that then has a feedback mechanism. Now, I want to say that these are, what we're talking about here is generally the species typical traits of relatively deep time, right? So that underlie our social cognition and our linguistic abilities, our cooperative capacity, our ability to imitate each other. But all of those have a big impact on the entire system of cultural inheritance. So that is one example of what we might call a trait system interaction. But if we can think of a single genetic trait influencing the whole cultural transmission system, we can also think of it, logically must think of it the other way and ask the question, what happens in the other direction? This is a new category, and people haven't sort of thought about it in this way very much. But for example, we can think of scientific medicine. I just benefited from scientific medicine by not being dead because I had some surgery in the fall, and I would be dead. So that is natural selection averted. And so I am thankful that we did that. But that's a really interesting example here because scientific medicine is a specific cluster of cultural traits, and that has an impact on, can have an impact on the entire genetic inheritance system, right? By influencing individuals as a whole, or influencing the nature of genetic variation over time. And we can look at all sorts of things, including reproductive medicine, the nature of industrial food system. And so together we can think of these two types as trait system gene culture coevolution. They can go in either way. Finally, there's sort of a final category. Now, on the one level, you can think about this as everything above all combined. That's actually not the point, though. The point is, are there ways in which an entire adaptive system interacts with another entire adaptive system when they're both confined to a single organism, right? A single species. And that's a big question, and it's hard to answer. But I think we're going to get there. So if culture is so adaptive for humans, then maybe we could ask this question, right? Maybe what's happening is humans are experiencing an inheritance transition from genes to culture. Culture is slowly becoming less important as we solve our problems increasingly through the means of technology, social organization, language, etc. That's an interesting hypothesis, and we're going to look at that. However, and it may be true. However, it's not the full story, because there's something that I've been leaving out here, which is a fundamental piece of the cultural evolution research. And it's a very strong piece of the consensus as well, which is that culture is highly group structured. It's more group structured. Cultural variation is more group structured than genetic variation in humans. Moreover, you're probably all familiar with the idea that group selection is not a super common thing in wild populations of organisms, although in the major evolutionary transitions, we see that it can happen. But it's not like the thing that you go out and you measure and, oh, there it is, right? You have to hunt for it. And it may only happen quite rarely. And when it does, it may change an entire lineage. And then all of a sudden it's not there anymore because you have new individuals. In culture, we see a lot of group level, of culturally defined groups. And selection between them, both selection on culture and selection on genes, being a strong force. Moreover, it's is one of the primary hypotheses for the emergence of human cooperation and sociality generally. We became cooperative with each other. We're far more cooperative than our primate relatives, by the way. We became so cooperative with each other, in part because we were in groups fighting each other. That's part of our genetic legacy, it could be argued. So one way to think about, to integrate all of these things is to say, maybe what's happening is a coupled inheritance a coupled transition in both inheritance and individuality. And that's what we call the ETII. And so I'm going to step through this and sort of show you how we think it might work. And then we'll look at some evidence, and then we'll talk about some research agenda, as well as ethical implications. So it starts with this adaptive capacity of culture, which I hope is at least partly evidenced now. Culture is super useful, and if it is so useful and so adaptive, then it seems that it probably acts to be able to cause an inheritance transition. If that is the case, that's great, except we have to keep in mind that human culture is extremely group structured. And so as a result, because it's so group structured, a lot of the adaptive capacity that emerges in culture emerges at the level of the group. For example, I don't know, let's see, this device certainly wouldn't have been created without a group. This device certainly wasn't created without groups. I don't know which other devices. Lots of devices depend on groups. So does this device I'm talking to you through. In fact, we are a group. Groups are everywhere. Humans are typified by groups, and groups are extremely effective. They're more effective per capita than individuals. So would argue a lot of people. And so as a result, there's a positive feedback here. And this positive feedback is at the center of this evolutionary transition in both inheritance and individuality. But as a result, cultural groups are important, and that drives cultural group selection and a transition in individuality. And so it's together, these two transitions, which are causally linked, which causes a coupled transition from genetic individuals to cultural groups. And so I have moved this slide up here. Oh my gosh, I think I've gotten rid of, I got rid of our best slide by accident. I don't know where I put our best slide, Zach.
That's how good the talk is. You just like got rid of the best slide as a flex.
It doesn't even matter. All the rest of my slides are so good. You need the best one. It's on the flyer. You can look at it there. I'm going to give you this. So how does this process play out, right? The idea is we start with genetic individuals, right, who have genes. The genes then interact with their extended phenotype, and the extended phenotype interacts with the environment. And so that's good as far as that goes. And then over time, millions of years, eventually at some future point, we have cultural groups, cultural superorganisms that create their extended phenotype and interact with their environment. How do we get from one to the other? We sort of envision a series of stages. In the first stage, we see some of these preliminary things where we have key genes coming online that enable cultural capacity. This is what a lot of gene culture coevolution research is focused on, our ability for sociality, our ability to learn from each other, to be so cooperative. This leads to the rise of adaptive culture in the first place. Adaptive culture then starts to accumulate. We build new life ways, new ways of surviving in novel environments, new languages, new pieces of technology, and that accelerates until we can start to see that culture starts to allow us to adapt to environments we would not be able to adapt to, or at least in the same amount of time. It becomes our primary mode of adaptation. Then perhaps what might happen is we could see the preemptive cultural adaptation, where culture evolves to solve adaptive challenges before genes get a chance. I'm going to step through these because this is all pretty, but you might fairly ask, so is there any evidence of this? And the answer is yes, there's so much evidence. And we're working hard on synthesizing it. There's a lot more than what I'm going to show you here, but this is the stuff we've been able to pull together. Let's start with the lactase persistence story, right? We have lactase persistence and dairying. That's trait gene culture coevolution. That's a sort of good example of a trait that we would have seen in stage 1 or stage 2. The emergence of sort of human docility. We're surprisingly chill with each other. You can't put mammals in our concentrations like we do and have them do what they do and take it so easy on each other with most other animals. And that helps us build cooperative social structures in organizations. Again, our food processing technology and traits, and then our strangely modified digestive system. Our brains, now we're starting to look at trait system, where we have key genetic traits which have enabled large amounts of improvement and adaptation in our cultural traits, brain size, our life history and our longevity, the emergence of menopause. In fact, interestingly, if you look cross species, that tends to be correlated with cultural transmission. There are some cetaceans and whales that have menopause as well, and they're also cultural. Linguistic ability, right? So these are a handful of traits that have emerged that are common across all humans. These are things that underlie what it is to be what we call modern humans. And these are characteristic of stage 1 and stage 2. That should be a hint already. So what about stage 3? What about this idea that there may be preemptive cultural adaptations, that culture might start solving adaptive challenges before genes get a chance? Right? We've already, of course, seen some of this, right? I just mentioned that I was saved from natural selection recently. Maybe that's related. So here's an example. Again, let's start with milk, right? Industrial dairy production is our modern expression of dairy, right? And we've taken it to such a scale that it outstripped the lactase persistence genes, and it causes indigestion. So that's a challenge. It's perhaps not a great adaptive challenge, but it's a challenge, and it's one that we have had the capacity to solve. We have created non-dairy milks and other alternatives to dairy foods. We've created lactase pills. My wife is lactose intolerant, and when she eats ice cream, she just takes a bunch of pills. So she doesn't need to produce it independently. She relies on a company somewhere else to create the lactase enzyme, I guess, and put it in pills, and then she eats it. It's amazing. Okay. Perhaps a bigger general concept here has to do with human social adaptations themselves, which are largely thought by a lot of people who study human evolution to sort of be influenced by our evolutionary history, which is largely not about million-person societies. Most of our last 50,000 generations have been in much, much, much smaller groups. And so the idea is human sociality is kind of based around a much smaller social unit. As a result, the workarounds hypothesis suggests that a modern society actually has a number of ways to deal with that, to plug us in to this much more complex and large modern society. The list goes on, and we can think of a number of these. Medical technology extending our life because being able to keep us alive because we reached ages that were previously not even possible. modern agriculture creating surplus calories, leading to other health problems, and then giving us solutions to those health problems. And on and on and on. There are a number of fascinating interactions happening when you include modern cultural evolutionary sort of adaptations or changes, and in their context in a gene culture perspective. I'm not going to go through all of these because I don't have time. So where are we? I think we're probably right about here at the beginning of stage 3. How many years have, so 2 million years have passed. I don't know how many, what fraction of millions of years or how many millions of years are in front of us, or whether they're extra stages or anything, but this is where we are in the framework that we've put together according to our collection of the evidence. So this leads to a handful of research questions that we can ask. First is, can we clarify some of this craziness in terms of definitions with anthropologists and biologists? And I think, yes, we can. This is much simpler if we think about related, connected, interacting inheritance systems. And we carefully think about their differences and how their differences cause them to work and influence their interaction over the very long term. Secondly, is our species undergoing an evolutionary transition in individuality? And I would say yes, we are, as a part of an ETII, only as a consequence of the inheritance transition. The inheritance transition seems to be the driver. Secondly, or next, what is the role of culture? The adaptive power of cultures appears to be driving the process. And then how do genes and culture interact in the very long term? Genes become part of a group level system of cultural adaptation. We could see this, right? For example, hypothetically, humans decide that it's a great idea to start modifying our DNA to suit, right? It'd be great if I didn't have flat feet, that would have been wonderful, because my knees, now that I'm middle-aged, would be less degraded if I didn't have flat feet. Or wasn't gluten intolerant, that also would have been sweet. So, so let's come back then to this question, and we'll do it in meme form. It's a little bit more like this then, right? So yeah, there's a leash. There's most definitely a leash, and the dog is dragging the kid. That's one way of expressing what's going on here, according to this framework. So there's some implications, I think, of this. I think there are implications for how we understand human uniqueness. We really understand a lot about what human uniqueness is. What we don't understand as a field is where it came from. Even given the fact that we have a lot of gene culture coevolution work out there. What is it a part of? The ETII is a unique explanation, a uniquely parsimonious explanation of human uniqueness. It helps us explain the demographic transition, which is an important phenomenon. It helps us think about how and whether and when environmental sustainability is a feature of human societies that might emerge. It helps us think about the possibility of life on other planets, even. And so our research program is sort of, really in a lot of ways just getting started. We have this ongoing sort of big set of work to synthesize and organize the existing evidence. That starts with the 2021 Proceedings B paper. More to come. We want to model the ETII to try to understand what conditions are actually necessary and try to have a little bit of a better handle on what it looks like to have two systems of adaptive inheritance in a single species. That is quite novel. It's not that it hasn't happened before. We might say DNA and RNA, but that was a while ago. And this one is happening now, and it's very different in a lot of ways. We don't have good theoretical understanding of that. One of the questions is sort of this question that Maynard Smith and Zutmery brought up about contingent irreversibility and this evolutionary ratchet. As we increasingly give or create cultural adaptations, especially if those cultural adaptations solve adaptive problems, we're simultaneously doing two things. We're gaining adaptive capacity in culture, and we're also stopping adaptive capacity from being accumulated in genetic variation. So that's a ratchet, right? That's a one-way process that just accelerates. So that's an important question. And what are the bounds and domains of that? What does that look like? We want to do a long-term data collection effort. We want to integrate some ethics research into this. But this leads us, though, to two types of hypotheses: inheritance-based hypotheses and individuality-based hypotheses. And these are just general. But if the hypothesis overall of the ETII is correct, then we could think of it's likely that we will see the accumulation of genetic traits that have cultural dependence. In fact, some already argue that we have that already, some of them. Specifically, we could say alleles that are deleterious in the absence of cultural supports, right? Like glasses, or for me, the ability to eat stuff that isn't wheat keeps me out of the emergency room. Reduced selection for individual genetic reproduction. That helps explain the demographic transition. Why would it be that we reproduce less than we have in the past? Increased involvement of cultural groups in reproduction, child rearing, education, job training, role specialization, and all of the rest. A cultural superorganism sort of figures out where individuals plug in to the system, and that's what that is. Increased importance of cultural group identity over kin-based identity as a prediction that sort of emerges from this. Similarly, we can think of the individuality-based hypotheses. So if the ETII hypothesis is right, then we should see increasing amounts of individuals outsourcing our extended phenotype and outsourcing even our fitness, therefore, to cultural groups. So there's some examples of this that are quite transparent, right? When you hook up to municipal water or other utilities, you're getting a benefit that depends on the cultural group, right? When you invest in a business, the benefit that you get depends on this larger group. We do this all the time, of course. We're embedded in groups, and a large fraction of human outcomes of your life, reproductive outcomes, success outcomes, health outcomes, possibly evolutionary fitness, depend largely on the cultural group that you happen to be born into. That's an important factor. So increasingly integrated and efficient and effective cultural groups would be another prediction, and then increasing group differentiation. So before we wrap up, I want to transition a little bit and talk about the ethical factors involved here, because they're not trivial. I put this slide up because it's happening now. The point here that I need to make quite clearly is that ethics don't change, right? Ethics are ethics, and they will remain that way, and we need to keep that in mind. And so first, just like evolution, and just like the problem when the people who were called social Darwinists tried to use the explanatory framework of evolution to enforce a set of awful ideas on human society, mistook the application of an explanatory framework as some sort of teleological reason for awful behavior. Evolution does not connote progress, right? And nor would any sort of movement along an evolutionary transition, such as we've laid out. It's not inherently good. It's simply descriptive. And so the idea of like value-based rankings, oh, this society is less industrial and integrated, that's absurd, right? That's a misapplication of a scientific framework. And in fact, it's really important and useful to think about different individuals and different societies holding different desired positions along that path, where do you want to be on the evolutionary transition? I'm not certain that I would be happy at the far end, guys. Let me just put it that way. The ETII is a theory of change, right? It's not a justification for poor treatment of individuals or groups. We want to make that point really clear. And so specifically, I want to make 2 points, though. One about war and one about racism. The first is that warfare has undoubtedly shaped human evolution. And it is, in fact, credited with driving the emergence of a lot of human cooperation and complex societies. It accelerates cultural group selection, both on culture and on genetic variation. And so therefore, it's been a force in the human ETII, if that is a thing. However, it's destructive, it's violent, and it causes pain. It is bad and it must be avoided. This is an ethical statement. Importantly, though, it's not inevitable. And in fact, recent human history, and in fact, recent human evolution shows that there are many types of cultural group selection. In fact, you don't have to have people dying for cultural group selection to happen. That's cultural group selection on genes. Constructive cultural group selection can happen without loss of human life. For example, through market competition. In fact, if you're interested in that, read the Francois paper, where you can see that trust and cooperation is bolstered because of between group competition in different industries in an economic sense. So it's possible to do some of these things, or to perhaps even go about the transition in different ways. Secondly, it's important to recognize that racism is a latent aspect of human psychology. The human group instincts are extremely strong, and that they rely on group identity cues that are activated by super simplistic racial dogma, right? But racism is cruel and it causes pain. It's bad and it must be actively averted. That's an ethical statement. The ETII framework does not support in any sort of way biologically based or culturally based racism. In fact, it's sort of quite the opposite, right? Cultural diversity accelerates cumulative cultural adaptation and innovation. There's a huge literature on how cultural diversity accelerates innovation. I mean, go into the business literature and just look around. It's all over the place. They've got numbers on it. In fact, they're putting it in information for boards, because boards need to know it, because boards are focused on making money, because it's so strong, it influences how much money they make. It's a big factor. But the point is that anti-racism efforts can benefit from the ETII framework because it helps us to understand, first, how humans evolved to group-oriented evolved our group-oriented sort of psychological legacy that allows discrimination to so easily emerge and endure. That's useful to know because it means that our task might be harder, right? It's not just a fad that humans are racist, right? It's harder than that. We've got to work harder to counter it too. So second, it helps us understand how racist dogma, which is a cultural trait, emerges to exploit that problematic psychological legacy, right? That is species general. And third, it also helps us to understand how to actively counter the evolution of racist beliefs or actions or systems or organizations, right? And do the opposite, right? How we can encourage the evolution of inclusive systems, inclusive organizations, inclusive nations. Okay. The point here, right, of course, is we still have choices, right? There's nothing about this that says that removes human agency or free will, right? There may be many paths along this this transition. Do we want the transition? Do we want the transition to proceed in certain ways? How has the ETII created factors we don't like or we do? How can we use this as a framework for doing good? these are still choices and questions we still get to ask. So anyway, that is the presentation. I wanted to hit that last point very clearly. Thanks to Zach for helping me through that. And that's it. So questions, thoughts? I'd love to hear your feedback.